Welcome to another Component 1 screencast on sociological theory, and in this video I'm going to introduce you to different types of feminist perspectives in sociology. And one key feature that feminism shares in common with the other two perspectives that we've looked at so far, functionalism and Marxism, is it's another example of what we call a structural approach. Remember, structural approaches are those theories that look at the way in which the overall structure of society shapes and determines individual behaviour. However, whereas the functionalist perspective is what we call a consensus approach, in other words, it's a theory that looks at how the operation of society benefits everybody, feminism, like the Marxist perspective, is what we call a conflict theory. Okay, it's a perspective that argues that society is set up in such a way that it systematically benefits one particular group at the expense of everybody else. But whereas the Marxist perspective argues that the main form of conflict within society is class conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, for feminism, the main social division within society is based on gender. And what all feminists have in common is the view that society is essentially a patriarchy. And a patriarchal society simply means one that is dominated by men. So a patriarchal society is where men have systematic power over women. And the main purpose of feminism within sociology is to try to explain this patriarchal society and examine the ways in which it's transmitted from one generation to the next by key social institutions such as the family, the school, the mass media, etc. In addition to highlighting patriarchy within the wider society, feminists have also argued that there's patriarchy within sociology, that the mainstream way of looking at social issues within the discipline has been from a male point of view, and the experiences and the issues that matter to women have often been neglected within mainstream sociology. And they've coined this term, male-stream sociology, to get across this argument that sociology has traditionally had an inbuilt male bias. Feminism isn't simply an abstract sociological theory. More importantly, feminist ideas have formed the basis for some really important political and social movements. The first organised wave of feminist protests occurred within the UK in the mid to late 19th century, where the focus was on introducing the right to vote for women. And by the early 20th century, the aims of this first wave of feminist protest had been achieved. The second big wave of feminist protests started in the 1960s and coincided with the introduction of the contraceptive pill, which became available in 1961, which meant that for the first time in history, women were in a position where they were able to control their own fertility. And this was significant because it raised confidence that women could play roles other than that of their traditional role as mother and homemaker. And so this second wave of feminist protests aimed to make improvements to a whole range of additional areas beyond the right to vote. And this included particularly women's role within the workforce, including issues to do with women's pay, legal rights, protection under the law. And out of this second wave of protests, we got important new bits of legislation such as the Equal Pay Act and the Sex Discrimination Act. And this second wave of feminist protests was influenced also by the success of the Black Civil Rights Movement, who had campaigned against racial discrimination and had coined the term racism to describe such forms of discrimination. And the second wave of feminism looked at gender discrimination and found an equivalent term. Okay, this idea of sexism. Now, by the 1970s, feminism has started to have a significant influence on the academic discipline of sociology. And nowadays, there are a wide variety of different feminist perspectives within sociology, We're just going to look at three of the main types of feminist approaches. Firstly, there's a perspective called liberal feminism that I've called a reformist perspective. This is a perspective that believes that you can bring about greater equality between men and women, not by changing society radically, but by reforming the law and existing social institutions. The other two versions of feminism that we're going to look at briefly, Marxist and radical, I've called these revolutionary perspectives because they believe that we need much more dramatic social change to really improve the position of women. Liberal feminists believe that the differences between women and men are the product of socialization and culture. So this perspective argues that women are conditioned into inferior sex roles and therefore often don't achieve their full potential within society. So from this perspective, the main concern of feminism must be education and also the fight for equal rights and equality of opportunity through the law. So this perspective argues that women must be allowed to compete equally with men in all spheres of life. And this is a perspective that's quite practical. It believes that the main thing that feminists should focus on is changing the law and improving social attitudes. So the emphasis is on reforming society rather than radically changing it. Marxist feminism, on the other hand, is sceptical that you can reform society and improve the position of women within the constraints of a capitalist economy. So from this perspective, patriarchy and capitalism are two forms of oppression that are mutually dependent. So this perspective argues that capitalism cannot survive without the oppression of women, and that patriarchy needs capitalism also to sustain itself. So advocates of this perspective highlight the ways in which women are forced to support capitalist society by providing unpaid economic contributions. So, for example, they produce and raise the next generation of workers through the free domestic labour that they provide, and they also provide a vent for the anger and frustration of the exploited male worker. They also constitute a key reserve army of labour, and this term reserve army of labour is used to describe those groups in society who move into and out of the labour market according to the demand in the economy for workers. And typically, the types of jobs that women are engaged in tend to be low paid, part-time, variable hours, very insecure work. And therefore they can be hired and fired more easily than other sections of the labour market. So in short, Marxist feminists argue that the emancipation of women can only take place once capitalism as an economic system is abolished altogether. They disagree with the liberal feminist idea that you can reform the existing system. Radical feminism, like the Marxist feminist perspective, is sceptical of the idea that you can simply achieve female emancipation through things like legal reform. They think more radical changes are needed. However, unlike the Marxist feminist perspective, radical feminism argues that we shouldn't simply see patriarchy as being a condition of capitalism. They would argue that patriarchy is a universal and enduring feature of most types of societies, not simply those that we call capitalist societies. And they would argue that rather than seeing capitalism as the main source of oppression for women, we should see men as the main source of oppression, that men in all types of societies have used their power and have used violence to control and subordinate women. So from this perspective, really important issues would be things like rape, domestic violence, the symbolic violence of pornography towards women. And they believe that radical changes are needed in society to reduce women's dependency on men, And the types of radical proposals embraced by this perspective would include things like the destruction of the traditional family based on the social institution of marriage. Now, feminist ideas have had a huge and positive impact on our society, and changes in the law have given women far greater opportunities in terms of things like careers and education and a range of other social spheres. However, despite these improvements, modern-day feminists, including the UK group, UK Feminista, would argue that women still face many barriers and many problems within our society. So they're still much more likely to suffer from discrimination, from low pay, from insecure work. Domestic violence remains a persistent problem. Women are underrepresented within politics, and despite the great improvements in female educational performance, the glass ceiling within the workplace remains. Men overwhelmingly dominate the top high-paid jobs and positions of power. And also women, because they tend to be lower paid than men, and because they tend to be more dependent on benefits because they're more likely to be a carer, they're the group that have been more hit by government cuts to welfare and public services as a result of the recent financial crisis. And in a media-saturated society, modern feminists are particularly concerned with some of the images and representations of women that you find within the mass media. Okay, as a follow-up to this screencast, make sure that you go onto iLearn and complete the interactive web-based lesson that will really deepen your understanding of this perspective. And then what we're going to do in the next screencast is look at a perspective called interactionism, which is quite different from the other perspectives that we've looked at so far. So once again, here's a reminder of where you get to the online feminism lesson. So click on this particular icon on iLearn, and then you'll find the link to the lesson. And this is essential lesson preparation in addition to making notes on this video.